My name's Matt, and I'm making a space station management game in Unreal Engine 5, where you can choose to focus on the guest experience, industry, or scientific research. So what's new for this update? Firstly, I've added both the missing factions to the game. This is the crew and the guests. I had the faction system to have both of them there, but I didn't have any events for them. Crew events are centered around affecting the output resources at the space station. As a result, if the crew is motivated, you'll get more of a particular output for certain components, at least when that event comes up. There's also an equivalent demotivated event where the output resources for a particular component will be reduced for a period of time. Guest events, on the other hand, primarily affect the reputation of that faction. It's important to keep guest rep high because if it isn't, well, your capacity for guests will be lowered. People won't want to come to your station, and if people don't want to come to your station, it's harder to make money off them. I've also worked a little bit on the visuals. As you can see, this planet here has a nice atmospheric effect around it. It's only very basic, but I do think it improves the look of the game quite a bit. On level 2, what was once just a barren rocky wasteland is now a barren rocky wasteland surrounded by another barren rocky wasteland. In other words, I added planetary rings to it. And these planetary rings are the set piece for our next major feature: mining. To implement mining the way I want it, I needed 3 things: a new component that would spawn mining drones, the asteroids that those drones would go and mine, and a 3D pathfinding algorithm. So why do I need to pathfind in 3D? Why can't I just use Unreal's built-in 2D navigation system and just move around all the components? Well, I don't want the asteroids to be on the same plane as the space station. 1, I think that looks a bit dull, and 2, it actually means they get in the way of the build area. That's not necessarily ideal. This solution isn't just for the drones. Anything that needs to go through the 3D space can use it. This finally means that the construction drones won't just be phasing through everything. So how do we navigate in a 3D space? Well, there's an interesting GDC talk that was done by the Sea of Thieves developers which went over how they made their shark AI. It used splines, but ultimately it required a lot of empty space, and since my drones will be operating in either an asteroid field or around the space station, this isn't actually ideal. Since my world is effectively built on a grid, that actually means having a voxel representation of where you can and can't go is quite good. But there's also another problem. There's a lot of empty space between, say, where the spaceships spawn and where the asteroids are and where the actual space station is. I don't want this empty area to have a highly dense voxel grid in it because that's going to take up way more memory than it needs to. So what I need is a way of breaking the world down into a set of voxels, but to ensure that those voxels are larger if we're in a larger, more open area. Well, I'm hardly the first person to have run into this sort of problem, and there is a solution: octtrees. If a collision is detected within a particular voxel, then we're going to divide that node into 8 child nodes, and we'll continue to do this recursively until one of 2 things happens. Either we no longer have a collision, or we've hit the smallest size possible for a voxel. We have this lower limit both to help with performance and also because beyond a certain point the data's often not very useful to us anymore. So now we have this thing called an octtree. Great, it shows us a representation of our world through these voxels and where you can and can't go based entirely off of the collision. So how do we pathfind? Well, to do this, we can use the A-star pathfinding algorithm. I think many people are familiar with this algorithm for its use in 2D grids. It's often used in strategy games, but there's nothing that requires it to be 2D. It just takes a list of its neighbours to go and check, and that's the sort of thing we can get out of our octtree. So after having done all this research into how I would do my 3D pathfinding, I started to write out the octtree, and then of course immediately found an Unreal Engine plugin that did exactly what I wanted. So yeah, I just used that. The plugin is called Customizable Pathfinding, or C Pathfinding, and it divides the world up using an octree, and pathfinds through it using A star. So now we have a 3D pathfinding algorithm, we can whip up a simple behaviour tree, and there we go. Mining is in the game. The drone's behaviour is very simple at the moment. It simply finds the nearest asteroid, navigates to it, mines until its capacity is full, and then returns the raw resources back to the mining station. These raw mined materials can then be processed by a new component. That's the refinery. The refinery takes in the raw ore and outputs, well, I called it an ingot for now, but that will almost certainly change in the future. The idea is you have to mine these resources, process them, and then those processed resources can be sent to factories within your space station and turned into useful goods. And speaking of useful goods, resources actually have a bit more of a point than simply making money. Certain components will, in addition to credits, now cost resources. Most things aside from the basic corridor components will require the use of alloy, but additional components such as photonics or control modules may be needed. Adding this provided a much needed credit resource sink that simply didn't exist before. You could just sort of hoard up a nice bunch of gold and sit on it. It also gives you a reason to maybe engage with the manufacturing or resource acquisition gameplay when you may have otherwise not needed to. But here's the thing, I don't want you having to build and vertically integrate absolutely everything on every single map. You actually won't be able to do that. Not every map is going to have every resource, and this will require you to trade. Before I had this relatively boring market, and that's received some attention this time. The market pricing is now dynamic, and you even get a nice graph view of what the previous 10 turns worth of pricing is. Again, if you remember back to my previous devlog, a turn is a 5-second tick. For the moment there's no real simulation going on in this pricing, it is random and it's limited by how much it can change each time. It's very, very simple, and I'd like to make that more mature in the future. But it was more about getting those supporting systems in place for the dynamic pricing and to be able to show it to you through the line graph. So that's all the major gameplay changes that I worked on this month. But not everything that needs to go into the game is gameplay. One thing you may have noticed is that we're actually orbiting the planet now, and we can even go into its shadow, into the dark. Now you're not actually orbiting the planet because that would be annoying and difficult to do given that I'm building different things in the world dynamically, and it would mean things would need to be parented to something and then it all rotated. It would get annoying. It's actually much easier to just rotate the planet, rotate the background, and rotate the sun. At the end of the day, it looks exactly the same as what you would have seen if we were rotating the space station around the planet. Another detail is that the planet's rotating slightly slower than the sun is rotating around it. This means that it does actually look like the planet is rotating on its axis, and as a result there's day and night on the planet. It's different from our orbit, and we would orbit multiple times in what that planet's day would be, but it's nice to still see that darkness slowly going around the planet. I also spent a day or so doing some sound design, just so that the UI would have some sound effects to it. I was noticing that the game was awfully quiet aside from the background music, and well, that's different now. Here's a quick run through of all the little sounds that I made. So there we go, that's pretty much everything I worked on this month. The only other exception is I made this new model for the spaceship, the transport ship, and I do think it looks a lot better than the old model. But of course, because it looks a lot better than the old model, it means everything else looks terrible, and I maybe need to revisit those things now that I've got a better idea for how I want things to look. The UI styling also desperately needs an update. I also need to make many icons for it. This will definitely be something that I work on next month. I think I might have said this every month and keep on putting it off. Oh well, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and a lot of it's gameplay stuff, and That seems rather important, certainly when you're trying to make an initial prototype. Another useful thing to do with your gameplay prototypes is to get user feedback. So, there's a demo available. It's up on itch.io, and you'll find a link to it down in the description. It definitely feels very much like a demo and not a sort of intro to a game, but any feedback that you have would be appreciated. So there we go, that's the update. I think we're now in the end of video ramble section. The next video I plan on making is a bit of a video on how we can share data across different components and actors within Unreal Engine. It's mostly going to be focusing around events and the subsystems that you can create using C++. Those are pretty important. I think once I've also finished making my new save system, I may very well do a video on that as well. So if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like. If you have any questions, leave a comment. And if the promise of those 2 future videos and any more development logs interests you, please consider giving the channel a subscribe. I'll see you next time.